Hello and welcome to my lecture on corrective feedback in teaching foreign language pronunciation. Let's start from teaching pronunciation and what it looked like in the past and what has changed for the last 10 or 15 years. So I guess that these of you who are in your 30s, all right, you remember your teachers who taught pronunciation by very traditional techniques and methods. So in the past, the most popular techniques were related to imitation. So the teacher used repetition technique, and you repeated the sounds over and over again. When you eventually imitated sounds correctly, you were rewarded a positive mark, right, by your teacher. But nowadays, definitely, these traditional methods are not used anymore. It was noticed by the researchers that the above techniques produce poor approximations to the correct phonemes. And even if you tried very, very hard to master the target language sounds, your pronunciation was still far from perfection. And what is interesting, even after such a course, phonetics course, the students' pronunciation was not acceptable by native speakers of English. So, generally speaking, your pronunciation was still not acceptable for native speakers' ear. Nowadays, the teachers use both traditional techniques based on repetition, listening to the tapes or CDs, right, repetition after the teacher, and a lot of different innovative techniques, such as mouthing, mirroring, drama techniques, or singing. Just to give you a clue what innovative techniques look like. Innovative techniques are based on finding some relationship between your phonetic system and the target language phonetic system. For instance, a poem by Julian Tuwim, Lokomotywa, may be practiced in a way that native speakers would do it if they were actually learning our native language as the target language. It's a very good exercise for your students. Have a try, right, with your students, or you may do it on your own. Stoi na stacji lokomotywa, ciężka, ogromna, and pociąg spływa. All right? It might be a lot of fun in a classroom, but at the same time, your students will very quickly understand what teaching pronunciation is about. And now let's have a look at some facts about teaching pronunciation. We've been talking quite a lot about pronunciation at the recent presentation, and I guess that you remember that pronunciation component is this element of foreign language teaching that is totally neglected by educators and teachers in the classroom. And whether we like it or not, this is the component that is really taught at school. It seems to be a kind of an alien, abstract subject to the average adult trainee teachers. What is more, teachers have no time to focus on pronunciation because they have to cover lots of material that is obligatory for the final exams. And you may also find some opinions that are voiced in literature that is devoted to teaching foreign languages, that LET classes that are concentrating on teaching pronunciation should be eliminated from college and university curricula. Why? There are lots of different reasons. Number one, because they are not effective, because they are focused on teaching individual sounds in isolation, right? What seems to be more effective is the course that is devoted not just to production of particular segmentals, right, so individual sounds, but the combination of sounds. So It's called suprasegmentals. Unfortunately, it's not practiced by many teachers at university or college level. Now let's discuss the main factors influencing pronunciation success. I guess that you remember from your SLA classes that pronunciation is this aspect of foreign language learning that is the most sensitive to affective factors, all right? We've been talking about it for a while at a recent presentation. What is more, there are not many learners who would master foreign language pronunciation at native-like level, for a number of reasons, of course, and some of these reasons are related to age factor. It has been pointed out in a number of various studies that early starters, so learners who start their exposure to the foreign language before the critical point, that is, before the age of 5, as Stefan Krashen claims, are more likely to attain a native-like pronunciation. In opposition to late starters, by late starters, we have in mind learners who are exposed to the foreign language for the first time after the close of the critical period, that is, after the age of 5. The critical period hypothesis, of course, is applicable not just to teaching pronunciation, but also to teaching other aspects of language. And I guess that you remember from your SLA classes that there are different hypotheses about this particular critical point. Lernerberg, who put forward the idea of critical period, he claimed that this critical point is at the age of puberty. He did not specify whether it's at the age of 12, 13, 14 or 15, right? But generally speaking, he claimed that it's somewhere between, around the time of puberty. However, as it comes to our acquisition of pronunciation, Lernerberg hypothesis does not seem to be much of use. So as it comes to teaching, learning pronunciation, Stefan Krashen's idea of critical period being somewhere around the time of the age of 5 is more applicable. But of course, have a look at the second hyphen. There are some exceptions. And I guess that some of you know people, learners, who are very, very successful in acquisition of foreign language pronunciation, despite the very late start. How come? How is it possible? The researchers put forward hypotheses about this miracle or success in pronunciation. It might be related to a great amount of instrumental and integrative motivation, 2 in 1, but definitely integrative motivation is more important. It's also related to your self-image and your self-perception as a learner. So if you think about yourself, I am capable of mastering pronunciation at a native-like level, it might happen that you will be successful. But of course, once again, this is minority that masters native-like pronunciation and not the majority of learners. And now let's focus on the second factor, namely learners' native language. Definitely, our mother tongue has a great impact on the mastery of the phonetic system of the target language. And have a look at some points. There are actually 3 aspects that we need to discuss, talking about the impact of learners' native language. The first one is typological distance theory. I guess that you remember this theory more or less from your SLA classes. According to typological distance theory, the languages that are typologically distant, so that are far away from each other, right? So if there is the language that your native language is Polish, right, and the target language is Chinese, definitely these languages are typologically distant, and you are more likely to attain success, right? Because the phonetic systems of these two languages are different. But we may expect the languages that are very similar, that are typologically close to each other, such as, for instance, Polish language, right? The Polish language and the Czech language, or the Russian language. We may expect that there are more similarities between the phonetic systems, and it will be easier for a learner to master the phonetic system of the target language. And the second issue that needs to be discussed is the problem with interference, first language interference. Of course, the second point is related to the first one. The more L1, L2 differences, the more problems in phonemes and their combinations and features might occur. These problems are not just related to articulation of the, phonemes in isolation, but that are also related to something that we call stress, all right? But by stress or accent, we mean actually some prosodic features such as rhythm, intonation. These are the features of the language that actually deceive non-native speakers of a language. I guess that you remember that interference from your native language might be both positive and negative, right? If it's positive, it means that some features of our Polish phonetic system facilitate the acquisition of the sounds of the target language. But actually, as you remember, Polish and English do not have much in common. These are totally different languages. Typologically, there are distant languages. This is something that actually accounts for lots of problems that we as non-native speakers of English, we have with Germanic languages, right? And the last point that needs to be discussed is the fact that it's impossible to standardize teaching pronunciation, but it's possible to lay down certain general guidelines. What does it mean? It means that even if there are learners representing different backgrounds, different native languages, and all of them want to master the phonetic system of English, it's impossible to write one universal book, right? One universal guidebook for all the learners who want to, attain this native-like performance, native-like pronunciation English. It is, of course, related to interference, right? So the best book that may be introduced to the classroom for our learners is the book that concentrates on some features of our native language and features of the target language, and at the same time such a book should explain what we should do as learners of English in order to avoid transferring these features from our native language to the target language. This is what is offered actually by many different books. The best book that is available on the market is the one that is written by Professor Sobkowiak. It's Phonetics, English Phonetics for the Poles. And the next factor that needs to be discussed is related to something that we call psychomotor considerations. This is actually the term that is used by Brown, and it's related to, as the very name suggests, to motor aspects, all right? Motor aspect related to pronunciation. What we mean in this point, this is the functioning of our speech muscles. Definitely, if we want to produce any sounds, we need to use our muscles, speech muscles. And it was noticed that since the time we are born, our muscles progressively improve. And in time, they become more and more adjusted, right, to the production of very complex sounds. But the problem is that in time, our speech muscles, they become specialized for the production of our native language sounds, right? What does it mean? It means that if there is late exposure to the target language, it is more and more difficult to master these sounds correctly, right, at a native-like level. And this is the argument actually for very early exposure of small kids to English or German or French or any other foreign languages. Because the earlier the child is exposed to the language, its speech muscles may very, very easily adjust for articulation of the sounds over target language. Now, as it comes to findings, research findings, we have very conflicting data from this research. It's due to the fact that different techniques or different methods have been applied in these studies. So, the main controversy about a number of different studies is that the researchers did not agree upon the point what slight accent means and what noticeable accent means. So a slight accent for me may be something totally different than it is for you, right? So it's really hard to and the second problem with this research is that it's hard to control some other factors, so-called intervening variables, intervening factors that also appear in any research related to acquisition of pronunciation. What are these intervening factors? Have a look. Attitude, all right? Definitely, if you have more positive attitude towards your accent, right, or towards the target language culture, target language community, you will be more, probably, right, you are more likely to be successful in target language pronunciation. Now, motivation, the same, especially if you display a very high level of integrative motivation, you are more likely to be successful in target language pronunciation. And finally, there is an issue of opportunity to hear the second language and using it. We'll be talking about later on when we focus on exposure, right? Amount of exposure to the second language. And another factor that needs to be taken into consideration is phonetic ability. I guess that you notice that there are some people that actually they grasp languages like this, right? They do not make any effort, and I don't know, their brain is just like a sponge, right? It absorbs all the languages without any effort. But you or your peers, right, you need to strive very, very hard in order to learn any new vocabulary or master pronunciation of the target language. And the researchers actually, they noticed this fact, and they came to the conclusion that some people display so-called phonetic ability, all right, or very high level of aptitude, and one of the components of this aptitude, you may call it talent, or gift for languages, or knack for languages, some element of this high linguistic aptitude is phonetic ability. Of course, there are people who are talented in, well, grammar, in lexis, right? But most of the time, people who are linguistically talented, they display high level of, they have the gift actually for all these aspects, for lexis, for grammar, and for phonetics. So, some people just have better ear for production and for comprehension, and at the same time for production of the sounds. In literature, you may also find some other terms. Aptitude for oral miming or phonetic coding ability. So you code the sounds that you're exposed to in a very effective way. Or auditory discrimination ability. Definitely, if you hear better, you are more likely to to produce better sounds, right? And I think that at this stage of our discussion, you may ask me the question, so does it mean that musicians are better language learners than non-musicians? This is the question that frequently appears at various lectures, right? Surprisingly enough, there is no positive correlation between your musical intelligence or the fact that you are a musician and your linguistic intelligence or your final performance especially in phonological domain. It was observed in some studies that musicians, they acquire the target language sounds faster or easier, all right? But from statistical point of view, the difference between musicians and non-musicians is not huge. So we cannot issue the statement that linguistic intelligence is correlated highly with musical intelligence. And have a look at the third hyphen. There are some tests that are designed for measuring phonetic ability. If you are interested in finding more information and you want to cover the test on your phonetic ability, have a look at Ken Worthy. He's actually an expert on these issues. And the next factor is amount of exposure to the second language. Of course, it's a very significant factor. But I noticed, while looking through the literature, that frequently this particular factor is overstated. What I mean is that frequently it is believed that if you do not have any contact with native speakers, especially, massive contact with native speakers, you will never ever be successful in mastering target language pronunciation. And this is, of course, not true. It's very problematic because exposure to the second language is understood by researchers in a different way. What does it mean, exposure, especially massive exposure? That you use language every day, 5 hours a day, 10 hours a day, twice a week? Nobody knows actually what it means, massive exposure or regular exposure, constant exposure. I noticed that in different research, exposure is viewed only with regard whether a person lives in a second-speaking country or a person learns pronunciation in a classroom. But it's a very clear-cut division, and it seems to me to be very, artificial. Can we say that a person who stays in Great Britain will necessarily be better in phonological domain than a learner who actually stays in Poland and learns pronunciation in a classroom? It might happen then that, have a look, learners in Poland actually have a great exposure to the target language than the learners or immigrants that have a constant, in inverted commas of course, right, constant contact with the language in Great Britain or in the States. So what we mean is that amount of exposure is a very multifaceted term, and what is important is how the learners really respond to the opportunity to listen to the language. All right, and now let's have a look at individual factors that are related to sociological factors. Definitely, these factors they are strong determinants of our success in second language pronunciation. They're related to, have a look, learner's sense of identity, learner's self-image as a person who is capable of mastering the second language pronunciation. We've been actually talking about it, right? And finally, learner's motivation and concern for good pronunciation. But to make the long story short, if you as a learner, you perceive yourself as a person being able to achieve something in your life, right? Being capable of obtaining something in your life, and your identity is very strong, definitely you are more likely to be successful in target language pronunciation than a person whose identity is very weak, he or she does not believe in his or her abilities, and his or her self-image is very negative. As it comes to motivation and concern for good pronunciation, I think there is nothing actually to explain. If your motivation, especially integrative motivation, is high, you are more likely to be successful. And the best example is, have you noticed, for instance, some learners who have friends living in Great Britain or the States, or actually people who got married, right, and they have boyfriends or girlfriends who are English. Definitely there are motivation to be taken as native speakers of the target language is higher than people who do not have this regular contact with native speakers. And now let's have a look at some research results. Positive feelings towards the speakers of the second language tend to develop more accurate accents. So it is something that we already discussed. This point is related to something that is called acculturation pigeonization theory, put forward by Schumann. I guess that you remember this theory from your SLA classes. Acculturation pigeonization theory was worked out by Schumann, and it referred to immigrant setting, right? So to English or any languages functioning not as a foreign language but as a second language. But we may find some similarities between his theory and what happens in a classroom. So what Schumann noticed in his research conducted in the States was that the learners who had more positive attitudes towards the American culture were more successful in the mastery of native-like pronunciation. He even introduced two terms, psychological distance and social distance. So if psychological distance and social distance between you as a learner, right, and the target language community is very, very large, you are less likely to be successful, right, in foreign language learning and presumably in mastery of target language pronunciation. But if this distance, your psychological distance, is short and social distance is short, you are more likely to be successful in foreign language. To give you an example, if you really believe that American food is really delicious, all right, that Americans are really joyful people, and you do not reject their culture, their styles of living, right, the rate of acquisition of American English, especially American English pronunciation, because we are focusing on pronunciation, will be faster than in these learners who despise American food, who despise American culture, and they say, well, Americans, they just rely on, junk food, nothing more. Positive feelings inevitably correlate with the integrative motivation. So if you are really motivated and you have positive feeling towards the target language target language community, definitely you will be successful in target language pronunciation. And there are some sociological obstacles, something that is observable in Poland, especially among adolescent groups. It's related to teenagers' preferences for the American variety of English. When we've been talking recently about the varieties of English, you notice that in Poland, the prevailing dominant standard English, this is the variety that is British English, right? And it's somehow imposed on our learners. But teenagers who like listening to pop music, right, who like watching American movies, they are more in favor of American English accent, right, general American pronunciation, not so much of British English pronunciation. So what happens if there is such a clash between the needs of a student who wants everything that is American and a teacher who imposes British variety of English on the student? It may give rise to some problems, some kind of inhibitions and problems with the mastery of target language pronunciation. And now let's try to answer the question, can teaching and training influence all these factors that we discussed before? Let's start from phonetic ability and age. Can I, as a teacher, have any impact on the phonetic ability of my students? Definitely not. And age, once again, we as teachers, we can do nothing about it, but definitely parents may decide about very early exposure of their children to the target language. Amount of exposure, definitely it can be influenced, but only to a limited degree. As it comes to identity, self-image or attitude factors, it's very disputable because on the one hand, teachers may influence all these factors, right? But definitely they may do it not directly. But indirectly, it is possible. So the teachers may make the learners interested in target language culture, right? In target language community, right? And in this way, a learner would be more motivated to master native-like pronunciation. So definitely not directly, but indirectly, yes, it is possible. And finally, motivation and concern for pronunciation. And definitely, this is the teacher who actually sets a kind of a model for the students of a correct pronunciation. If you as a teacher, you say to students that pronunciation is important, right? That pronunciation is related to intelligibility in the target language, and you show to your students that concern for pronunciation, it is something that is rewarded by you, definitely your learners will follow you, and it will be very effective in terms of their final acquisition of pronunciation. And finally, let's focus on the role of corrective feedback. That is the main topic for today, right? So if we know what factors influence teaching and learning successful pronunciation, now let's try to pose a question. Should we correct our students' mistakes or not? Before we do it, before we discuss it, two things that should be actually explained. Number one, what is the difference between mistake and error? I guess that you remember from your methodology for language learning and teaching that error, it is something that we are not aware of, right? Why a mistake, usually when we commit a mistake, we are able to correct ourselves. So we are conscious of using incorrect form, right? And number two is that there is controversy about error correction. Some actually researchers, some specialists in the field, they actually claim that we should not correct any errors. Especially if our students are focused on, if we are talking about oral performance and our students are focused on conveying some message, right? So the question is really very disputable. Should learners' errors be corrected or not? If we should do it, the question is when we should do it. And now, number two, which learner's errors should be corrected? Should we correct all the errors? So, if I make a mistake, for instance, I omit S in the third person, should I actually correct my mistakes? Well, everybody knows that it just, slip of a tongue, okay? Now, how we should do it? And finally, who should do the correcting? The peers, the learner himself or herself, or maybe the teacher? So now let's focus on typical problems with corrective feedback. The question is whether we should provide as teachers immediate corrective feedback, or maybe it is advisable to use delayed corrective feedback. Of course, it depends on a number of factors. It depends on the nature of our student, right, and the nature of a task. What I mean by nature of a student is his or her personality. There are some students who actually get annoyed when a teacher corrects his or her mistakes, right? And it depends on the nature of a task, in a sense that there are some situations in which a student conveys a message, an oral message, right, and making any interruptions in his or her performance may be very annoying and demotivational for your student. So some teachers, what they do is they use not immediate corrective feedback, but they actually rely on provision of delayed corrective feedback. What does it mean, delayed corrective feedback? It means that you as a teacher, you take a slip of paper, right, and you take down, all the examples of incorrect forms, right? And later on, at the end of the class, you discuss all phonetic problems or any other problems, grammar problems or lexical problems with the whole class, without pointing to your student that you made a particular error. So this is one of the approaches that definitely we should provide corrective feedback to our learners, but the question is whether it should be immediate or delayed. But there are also some other claims that actually errors, have a look, are an inevitable part of the learning process. So intervention is pointless and counterproductive. What Truscott from 1999 really has in mind is that it's better to leave your learner on his own, and he or she sooner or later will correct himself. So he just takes for granted that when a learner is exposed to the correct form, he or she sooner or later will start using the correct forms. Good and bad approach, definitely it depends on your learner, because there might be some learners who are exposed to correct forms, but they will never actually notice what kind of mistake they committed in a sentence. And there are, of course, some other problems with corrective feedback, namely its inconsistency, ambiguity, and ineffectiveness. What is the basic actually problem? We as teachers, we try to do our best to teach our students that the form that they use is incorrect. But it happens that the provision of corrective feedback does not always guarantee the use of correct forms by our students. Why is it so? Well, have a look at some points. Teachers should be systematic in clear provision of corrective feedback. There is the stress on the word systematic, systematicity, right? It's not enough for a teacher to say just once. We don't say beer, but we say bear, all right? But we should do it on systematic, regular basis. And number two, techniques used by teachers should give enough time for self and peer repair, all right? What is stressed in this point is that giving the correct form by a teacher may be effective, but it's never as effective as self and peer repair. So if you make your student notice a mistake on his or her own and repair the mistake, definitely this correction will be more effective and definitely will be long-lasting. And corrective feedback is as close a match as possible between teacher's intent, the targeted error, and learner's perception of the given feedback. And I think there is nothing to discuss in this point. And finally, corrective feedback focus on one error at a time over a period of time, which means that if our learner makes 3 or 4 mistakes in one sentence, we should focus on each error at a time. Do not discuss all of them at the same time. Okay? So first explanation, then maybe practice, asking your students for counter feedback, for repetition, all right? And have a look over a period of time. So this is something that was stressed at the very beginning, that it's not enough to ask your learner to repeat the correct form just once. And another problem is, with the corrective feedback, is this related to affectivity. Affectivity or affective domain is related to emotional domain, emotional side of our learners. As you remember from the first or the second slide from our presentation, pronunciation is this aspect of foreign language learning that is most sensitive to our human emotions, right? So what might happen if we provide this corrective feedback to our learners? In other words, if we criticize our learners, you use incorrect form, what might happen is anxiety. So corrective feedback might be the source of anxiety. And consequently, it gives rise to unwillingness to speak, or inhibition and low self-esteem. So the learner thinks, oh my God, I'm not able to master this pronunciation, right? And his self-esteem becomes lower and lower, right? And finally, motivational decrease. And a person is not motivated anymore to strive to master this native-like pronunciation. Now, let's pose the question, what does provision of corrective feedback depend on? Definitely learning and teaching style. Each of you presents a different learning style, and definitely your learning style will have an impact on your teaching style in a classroom. There are some learners and teachers who prefer the provision of immediate corrective feedback, while there are others who prefer delayed corrective feedback, and there are some teachers who actually support this idea of the lack of provision of corrective feedback. So it depends on your style, of your teaching and learning style. Number 2, learner's personality. This is something that we discussed. And relationship among learners. Relationship among learners, this point is especially applicable to the situation when you as a teacher, you expect from the peers to correct themselves. And finally, the nature of error. There are some errors that do not need to be corrected. You just note that the student displayed a typical slip of a tongue phenomenon, right? And there is no use in correcting a student and making him or her feel, anxious. In the past, it was teachers' obligation to correct all the mistakes. But nowadays, there is a kind of a shift from teacher to a learner, and from teacher to, generally speaking, peers, all right? So peer correction is nowadays more, let's say, fashionable, more popular, and learner's correction. Why is it so? I think it's related to dominant trend that is nowadays, namely, there is a great emphasis of autonomy. So learners should be autonomous from the very beginning, meaning that they should be responsible for their learning process. You're responsible not just for your learning process, but also for your errors. Now, type of corrective feedback, most suitable and effective in a given situation. You as a teacher, you should use your intuition. You just know that in a given situation, it's better not to correct somebody's mistakes, right? If you have any doubts whether the provision of corrective feedback should be implemented or not, have a look at Russell and Spader's book, in which they analyzed 56 different studies. In these studies, focus on formal instruction and the role of corrective feedback, you may find some very important, significant findings. Namely, have a look. Number one, that definitely corrective feedback has a great impact on foreign language learning. And number two, so it is effective, right? So in other words, it's better to correct than not to correct somebody's mistakes. And number two, corrective feedback leads to students' repair, leading to students' repair is more effective. So this is what I've actually discussed before, that you as a teacher, if you make your learner correct himself or herself, it will be more effective and it will have a more long-lasting effect. So now let's have a look at various types of corrective feedback. The first one is related to providing your students with some meta-linguistic explanation of his or her error. Let's have a look at an example. A student said the company has to develop, right, a typical error, right, committed by Polish students of English. And the teacher's corrective feedback is, you need to change the stress, right? So you refer to some meta-linguistic knowledge of your students. And the student says, the company has to develop. Another type of corrective feedback is clarification request. Have a look at an example. I didn't eat dinner, that's what a student says. And teacher says, what did you say? Or you may also say, excuse me, or I don't understand, or what do you mean? So ask some extra questions to elicit from a student a correct form. And now we have repetition. Yesterday I paid the bill. You paid the bill? All right. You may use it with typical intonation, rising intonation, to suggest to your student that there is an incorrect form that is used. But what is important in repetition is that you as a teacher, you also use incorrect form. And then we have expression. By expression, we mean gestures, facial expressions that are used by a teacher. A point that should be made at this stage is that gestures or expressions, facial expressions, should be used with caution. There are no universal gestures, all right? So each of you as a teacher, you should work out some kind of a system of communication between you and your students, right? To give an example, for instance, if a word order is not correct in a sentence, you may use a gesture like this, okay? So inversion. And there are lots of different gestures, but once again, you need to work out your own system and discuss the system with your students. There is also elicitation technique of provision of corrective feedback. Within this elicitation, we have actually 3 sub-techniques, namely filling the blank, asking some questions, and asking your learner to reformulate utterance. Definitely, elicitation is one of the most effective, productive techniques, and it has a very, very long-lasting effect. Have a look at at an example. I don't like spicy food. And you as a teacher, you just say spicy, all right, and you wait for your student to correct himself or herself. What is good about this particular technique is that your student has to be constantly, attentive. He has to be alert all the time. And finally, we have recast. Recast is a little bit more difficult and it's frequently mistaken with elicitation. So have a look at formal definition. Recast refers to teacher's reformulation of all or part of a student's utterance minus the error. All right? So a very typical error made by Polish students of English is, I had to delete it, right? And teacher says, oh, delete it, right? So this is recast. All right, thank you for your attention, and I guess that in your practical work as a teacher, you will use all these forms of corrective feedback.